The year is 1912. Social Democrats in Germany, who had always won the largest number of votes, now won the largest number of seats in the Reichstag. In Basel, a manifesto was signed unanimously by all parties of the Second International, declaring that the outbreak of war would create an economic and political crisis, which should be used to hasten the downfall of the rule of capital. In the counter-revolutionary bulwark of Old World Europe, the Tsarist Empire, the bourgeois democratic revolution 8 years prior was flaring up again and precipitated a final split within Russian social democracy on the question of its purpose, whether it was to precipitate proletarian socialist revolution in Europe or to submerge it in mass democracy. And in the New World, an electoral battle was being waged by two versions of liberal progressivism, equally opposed to the rising proletarian socialist party that vied for the legacy of the revolution whole scale and the vision of its future. Recall that Abraham Lincoln's revolutionary assumption of dictatorial power in the Gilded Age of industrial capital, the presidency returned to its original role of merely executing the laws legislated by Congress. Quite simply, from 1880 to 1914, there was in the United States neither a permanent bureaucracy nor a standing army. How the social question would be prosecuted politically, what the meaning of the state would be, was still an open question. Leading the charge of progressivism was the unabashed bull moose new nationalism of Theodore Roosevelt. The industrial surplus being generated by the U.S. working class should be exported to Latin America and East Asia through investment in new mines, factories, and railways. Conversely, new minerals and raw resources should be extracted from the entire face of the earth and sent to fuel the industrial powerhouse of Detroit. What is more, the state should proactively intervene in big industry, take a cut of its profit and give it back to the workers at its feet in the name of economic and social justice. Finally, the expansion of the executive powers of the presidency should not be lamented, but utilized. When war broke out in Europe, Roosevelt called for immediate entry to put a quick end to it and get the world back to business. Exploiting labor everywhere, exporting capital to release the industrial surplus, redistributing profit to harmonize class conflict at home, single-minded resolve in the pursuit of industrial dynamism. In all this, Roosevelt had looked under much more open skies to Bismarck, the chancellor who had founded the German Empire 40 years earlier. And just as Luxembourg could alone have been adequate to the political historical necessity expressed by Bismarck, so only was the proletarian socialist party of Debs adequate to that expressed in Roosevelt. By contrast, the middle-class reformism of Woodrow Wilson took a middling road, applying the small-town values of cooperation to the big city and from there onto the world stage. Already in the 1890s, Wilson had advocated combining the separate powers of legislation and execution into a parliamentary model, where, with the aim set by Parliament, it would be carried out by an impartial civil service of expert technicians. Where Roosevelt had said in 1905, "I shall have to spank some brigade of a Latin American republic to ensure the rule of the dollar and doubly free wage labor," by 1913, Wilson was saying, "They shall have to be educated to elect good men." Like Taft, he had difficulty distinguishing between commercial policy, the mere trade of goods, and the export of capital. But by the end of his term, he has returned to the original, if imprecise, designs of Roosevelt, encouraging financiers to invest in East Asia, and even weighing the value of a token military presence. While insisting on small government with his new freedom, he ends up implementing all the state redistributive policies advocated by Roosevelt's new nationalism. When the SPD in Germany smashed the workers' revolution they had themselves built, they turned, over the heads of Britain and France, to Woodrow Wilson. To recover the aborted horizon of 1917, three misconceptions must be dispelled about Wilsonian liberalism and its ally in the ossification of revolution, Stalinism. This does not entail any immediate implication to geopolitical position-taking today, but rather is intended to throw a critical historical light on the entire body of assumptions shared by all positions alike, namely, a century of counter-revolution. First, on the question of national self-determination, Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin appear to share a common liberalism. Both assert the bourgeois right of a people to determine their own state, and both assert this right as a way of realizing global social cooperation. Underlying this shared liberalism, however, is a profound historical difference. Wilson's progressive middle class thought they could simply repeat and manage the bourgeois democratic revolution in the era of imperial industrial capital, whereas Lenin recognized that the era of bourgeois democratic emancipation was now over on its own terms, and any appearance of bourgeois democratic revolution must press the social question of proletarian labor or be suppressed by it. The difference is that Lenin saw proletarian socialist struggle in the imperial core, leading to an ever higher union of states and peoples, whereas Wilson's League of Nations facilitated the atomization of people along cultural, ethnic, linguistic, or other arbitrary lines. We'll let Lenin speak for himself. Quote, "The Russian proletariat cannot march at the head of the people towards a victorious democratic revolution, which is its immediate task, or fight alongside its brothers, the proletarians of Europe, for a socialist revolution, without immediately demanding, fully and without reservation, for all nations oppressed by Tsarism, the freedom to secede from Russia. This we demand not independently of our revolutionary struggle for socialism, but because this struggle will remain a hollow phrase if it is not linked up with the revolutionary approach to all questions of democracy, including the national question. We demand freedom of self-determination, i.e. independence, i.e. freedom of secession for the oppressed nations, not because we have dreamt of splitting up the country economically, or of the ideal of small states, but, on the contrary, because we want large states, and the closer unity and even fusion of nations, only on a truly democratic, truly internationalist basis, which is inconceivable without the freedom to secede. Just as Marx, in 1869, demanded the separation of Ireland, not for a split between Ireland and Britain, but for a subsequent free union between them, not so as to secure justice for Ireland, but in the interests of the revolutionary struggle of the British proletariat. We, in the same way, considered the refusal of Russian socialists to demand freedom of self-determination for nations, in the same sense we indicated above, to be a direct betrayal of democracy, internationalism, and socialism. In other words, either a state would join a socialist union of American republics voluntarily, or if it wasn't voluntary, then this was evidence that the proletarian labor question wasn't being pressed politically, and therefore it wasn't socialist. Second, and to flesh that out, Lenin understood that any attempt to merely repeat the bourgeois democratic revolution under proletarian conditions necessarily leads to a reversal of means and ends. This can be seen in the category of the nation itself, when, in the era of the imperial world state, it got reified as nationalism. When Wilson, as a liberal, looked to find some substantive criterion of self-determination for international law, all he could find was people as they were, and not what they could be. In this way, his vision of cosmopolitan peace could only succumb to the atomization already underway. The horror is that this liberal middle-class progressivism linked up with the revisionist rot within Marxism on the issue of national cultural autonomy and petty bourgeois linguistic nationalism, particularly in the wake of the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire. Already by the 1860s, on the newfangled census, by requiring that people identify with a language, people actually began to identify with a language. There are three phases in the category of the nation as it came to express the promise of bourgeois emancipation. Originally, in the deep era from 1648 to 1848, the nation was merely a vehicle for and constitution of bourgeois emancipation, the internationalism of labor, the third estate, against the internationalism of caste, the church and aristocracy. In the second phase, from 1789 to 1871, from the French Revolution to the founding of the German Reich, liberal aspirations on the continent were expressed by the threshold principle, namely, any nation was historical that had the capacity to industrialize, meaning a large enough contiguous territory, a cultural literary elite capable of public administration, and above all, the ability to mobilize doubly free wage labor. Italy and Germany, it was clear to all, set this threshold. Like anyone aspiring for bourgeois emancipation, Marx supported the smashing of rival backward fiefdoms in the unification of Italy and Germany. But unlike the Social Democratic Republican Giuseppe Mazzini, Marx saw that this unification was setting an unprecedented historical task. When, in the wake of the U.S. Civil War, proletarian labor got together to assert its bourgeois right and founded the first International Working Men's Association, the final aim proposed by the Mazzinians was a federation of states. Marx cut down their rambly preamble and clarified the task: the economic self-emancipation of labor by means of political action, the abolition of class rule, and his proposal was adopted unanimously. Lenin calls this period, from 1789 to 1871, the era of bourgeois democratic revolution. The third phase, the era of Bonapartism, or what is the same thing, imperialism, was signaled by the degeneration of the bourgeois democratic revolution on its own terms in France. When the National Assembly smashed the Parisian proletariat and collapsed into the farcical nephew of Napoleon, Louis Bonaparte, who, donning the iron death mask of his uncle, dissolved the parliament and established an empire. Repeating the French Revolution, the revolt of the Third Estate had issued in Bonapartism. 20 years later, Bismarck founds the German Reich when Bonaparte the Farce smashes the Paris Commune to found the Republic. This global retrogression of bourgeois democratic revolution is what Marx and later Marxists meant by imperialism. From 1880 to 1914, global industry, particularly in America and Germany, but also Russia and Japan, begins to overtake the original workshop of the world, Britain. The industrial surplus, because its generation was the exploitation and therefore self-contradiction of living labor, had to be exported. Capital had to be invested elsewhere. In this imperial age of monopoly capital, if the bourgeois democratic revolution did not get prosecuted as socialism, if labor did not take the reins of capital, then its promise would become static and self-defeating. The French Revolution was itself reified in the form of petty bourgeois nationalism. Petty bourgeois, not just because it was literally the shop owners, civil administrators, and school teachers who were most enthused by it, but because without socialism, the bourgeois revolution was becoming a parody of itself. Kautsky remarked that it is only in the era when proletarianization was actually erasing the differences between nations that national literatures could garner a degree of popular mobilization. Before 1893, liberal aspirations for Irish independence were never expressed in terms of the Irish language. In distinction to the Mazzinian era of the industrial threshold principle, the nation was no longer defined as a task and territory, but was a reality embodied in individuals. No immigrant group to the United States claimed national autonomy, but any Democratic Party politician knew that appealing to the Irish as Irish or the Poles as Poles cashed out at the ballot box. Ethnic, cultural, linguistic particularity became the only chain left to cling to, an abstract substitution for the proletarian condition itself. Without exaggeration, the cultural turn under Stalin of the 1930s, where nationhood gets reified as a property of the passport, or the cultural turn again of the 1960s, where the nationalism of the oppressed became an end in itself, are mere degenerative repetitions of this initial recoil from the task of proletarian socialism. With the same thunder that Lenin denounced greater Russian chauvinism, he did not fetishize oppression in national form. Once again, he speaks best in his own words. Marxists do not confine themselves to the bourgeois national standpoint. For several decades, a well-defined process of accelerated economic development has been going on in the South, i.e. the Ukraine, attracting hundreds of thousands of peasants and workers from Great Russia to the capitalist farms, mines, and cities. The assimilation, within these limits, of the Great Russian and Ukrainian proletariat is an indisputable fact, and this fact is undoubtedly progressive. Capitalism is replacing the ignorant, conservative, settled music of the Great Russian or Ukrainian backwoods with a mobile proletariat, whose conditions of life break down specifically national narrow-mindedness, both Great Russian and Ukrainian. Even if we assume that, in time, there will be a state frontier between Great Russia and the Ukraine, the historically progressive nature of the assimilation of the Great Russian and Ukrainian workers will be as undoubted as the progressive nature of the grinding down of nations in America. The freer the Ukraine and Great Russia become, the more extensive and more rapid will be the development of capitalism, which will still more powerfully attract the workers, the working masses of all nations from all regions of the state and from all the neighboring states, should Russia become a neighboring state in relation to the Ukraine, to the cities, the mines, and the factories. Third, and finally, what was at stake when the SPD rejected its own proletarian revolution? Quite simply, it refused responsibility for the crisis of the imperial world state and opted for a mere regime change instead. When Bismarck united the German fiefdoms into a state, he was merely laying the groundwork for the transitional dictatorship of the proletariat, not because of the imperial state itself, which was a symptom of the crisis of transition, but because it facilitated industrialization and the buildup of proletarian labor into a self-conscious subject in the form of international social democracy. When the social democratic revolution finally came, and Soviets sprang up in Petrograd and Berlin, the party itself submerged the social question into mass democracy in accordance with Wilson's liberalism. This middle-class liberalism, applied to the world stage, was riven with the ambiguity inherent to the scheme of progressive reform itself between substantive emancipation and formal control. On the one hand, many different people doing many different things. On the other hand, some common scheme, rule, or plan to express and encompass them all. This ambiguity, where the particular case rarely fits the rule but makes no sense apart from it, and where the rule starts to get applied for its own sake and without reference to the particular case, where ends get subverted by means and where means become their own ends, is the technical expression of social irrationality. This was expressed within liberalism after Wilson as the antinomy of the idealism of liberal democracy and the realism of collective security. Formally, we should all be self-determining, but really, we're securing resources and power. But securing resources and power is just the form of substantive self-determination. As Georg Lukács will later explain, the rule must be formulated for its own sake because its real living basis, the material content the rule attempts to subsume, is the forces of production themselves, which are already beyond it, the alienated social powers of industry that have outstripped our contemplative comprehension. This is why Lenin exhorted revolutionaries to be as radical as reality itself. To sum up, we return to the question posed in the U.S. election of 1912. Obviously, for Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson alike, war or violence was always the result of a bankruptcy of diplomacy or the failure of indirect influence. The original bourgeois aspiration toward cosmopolitan civil society, the uniform tendency toward peace, could, however, only have been taken up by proletarian socialism, and for this reason it is important to see why the political necessity which the proletarian party of Debs, Luxemburg, and Lenin aimed to meet was much more clearly expressed in Roosevelt's imperial new nationalism than in the petty bourgeois ethnic democracy of Wilson's new freedom. After all, Wilson ended up doing everything Roosevelt was proposing anyway, facilitating the export of capital, redistributing profit in the name of economic and social justice, entering the war. A few years earlier, with reference to the conquest of the Philippines, Roosevelt's Secretary of State Elihu Root had lamented that the Constitution follows the flag, but does not quite catch up with it. Reversing this, we might say, the inalienable bourgeois right of the Philippine natives preceded the flag, and the inability of the Constitution to catch up was due to the new industrial self-contradiction intrinsic to the division of labor it expressed. Small-town Americans at the time speculated that the Catholic Church in Baltimore, consorting with Lombard Street in London, was in conspiracy against the Filipinos' native liberty. As Lenin put it, the petty bourgeois American anti-imperialism of the 1890s was the last gasp of bourgeois democracy. By contrast, for Lenin, imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism because it was the potential for socialism. And for this reason, Eugene Debs proclaimed on the 1912 campaign trail, "The Republican, Democratic, and Progressive parties uphold the wage system. The Socialist Party demands its overthrow."